Hey, and welcome to the third short lecture from Chapter 5. So, in this short lecture, we're going to begin by talking about some of the important concepts in the system's approach to communication. Now, these are, again, just sort of basic tenets that undergird all of the thinking involved in the system's approach to communication. So, all behavior is communicative. I teach my students about this in interpersonal communication. Anything you do communicates a message to someone else. How you dress, how you look, even not communicating is communicating. Um, by not saying anything, you're saying something, right? So the idea here is that all behavior is a form of communication. And also that intent isn't necessary for communication to happen. So I don't, I might try and just keep my mouth shut so that I don't send out any kind of message, right? But in keeping my mouth shut, I'm still sending a message, right? So in that sense, intent really isn't necessary for the act of communication to happen. And furthermore, right, we all know that we might say something that we intend to be a compliment, but someone takes it the wrong way, right? So my intent really doesn't matter to the other person if they take it a different way, right? And this is something that I talk about a lot in all my classes, the idea that meaning isn't made when you speak the words. Meaning is made when the other person hears them and thinks about them and tries to figure out what you're saying and the meaning that they make in their own minds. So again, intent isn't necessary for communication. And communication, the act, is relational, so it depends on your relationship to the person or persons you're communicating with. And it's contextual. So that means that the way that we make sense out of what people are saying to us is all really based in context, right? On the situation. So an example of this, right? You go to the doctor's office, and the doctor says, "Okay, I want you to disrobe and sit on the table. Take your clothes off and sit on the table." Now, because that's the doctor's office, you don't lose your mind and freak out. But if you walked into, your, I don't know, if you walked into Target and the clerk was like, "Okay, take off your clothes and sit up here," you'd lose your mind, right? Because clearly you interpret the same message in different ways depending on context, depending on where you're at. Furthermore, meaning from a systems perspective is inherent in the process of what we call punctuation. So, punctuation in systems processes are just like the punctuation in written language. It's the way that we organize information into meaningful units. So you put a period at the end of a sentence, and that indicates, hey, this is a sentence. This is a self-contained thought, right? And then you see another sentence and another period, and that helps you differentiate that sentence from the one that came before, and so on, right? And we do the same kind of thing in our experience, in what we call our phenomenological experience. So phenomenology is just a fancy word for the study of how we make sense of the world, right? How we view the world. So meetings, casual conversations, sales pitches, telephone calls, these are all examples of punctuation, ways that we punctuate our lives to make sense of them, right? Oh, I'm in a meeting now. That's the cat that I hate. Did I tell you that I have a cat that I fucking hate? That's the cat. I gotta let him out of my office. Hang on a minute. I hate you, cat. Get out. Get out. Never come back. Okay, so the cat's gone. So again, we punctuate our lives by in the same way we do sentences. We make sense of them by dividing them into things like meetings, conversations, telephone calls, etc., etc. Right? And of course, different people can punctuate the same stream of events in different ways, and this can create all kinds of misunderstandings uh, amongst people who experience exactly the same thing. And we know, for example, that different people view situations differently, right? I mean, there have been any number of movies that deal with this idea, probably the most famous of which is Akira Kurosawa's. Oh shit! What's the name of it? Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, right? Which is the same story we're told from the perspective of different characters who witness the same events, right? And they have vastly different kinds of they make different kinds of sense out of all seeing the same thing, right? So they just have different perspectives on the same thing. This brings us to the work of Carl Weick. He's a business school professor, and he says that in understanding systems theory, it's important to understand that people aren't rational, and that people in organizations routinely make irrational decisions. So he wrote a famous book called The Social Psychology of Organizing. And in there he says that people in organizations don't really so much work as just engage in organizing processes, right, punctuating their experience, and continually try to make sense of the processes in which they're already participating, right? So he says organizing is about fallible people who keep going. Organizations are just collections of people that are trying to make sense of what's going on around them, right? And indeed, sometimes we don't even know what the hell's going on around us till it's over. And then we look back on it and say, oh, yeah, okay, we did that. And that's what we call retrospective sense making. So, for example, right, I'll give you an example that might hit close to home. So when we choose textbooks for a class, you might think that your professor gets a bunch of textbooks and looks at them all and examines the information and asks his or herself, like, which textbook is going to be best for my students? Which one explains these ideas most clearly and in the best ways that are most easily understood and so on. But I'll tell you right now, that's not really how it works, right? There are a whole bunch of factors that go into deciding textbooks that have nothing to do with that. Not the least of which is, oh, well, this textbook, I've taught this before, I'm familiar with it, I know what's in it, I don't have to change my slides for the class, so I'm going to keep using the same textbook, right? I mean, there are all kinds of factors that influence that decision making that exist outside the realm of the organizational goal, right? If the organizational goal, for example, is to teach you the most I can about organizational communication, then I should be examining the textbooks from purely that perspective. But that's not what happens. Indeed, sometimes we choose textbooks because the people send them to us for free, and we're like, oh shit, look at this is a pretty good one. Or because the rep from the book place takes you out to lunch, right? I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that people do things. And so as a result, Weick is saying, listen, organizing process is messy, it's ambiguous, and so sometimes we just look back on it and say, oh yeah, now that I've already picked it, and then we rationalize it, right? We rationalize our decisions, and that's how organizations work a lot of times. So in keeping with Weick, indeed, he maintains that one of the ways that organizations, indeed, one of the ways that many phenomena are created is just through being talked about, people just making sense of things. And so your book talks about this story of the umpires, where there are three umpires that disagree about calling balls and strikes. And the first one says, I call them as they are. The second one says, I call them as I see them. And the third one, the most clever one, says, they ain't nothing till I call them. Now, the idea here is that if a pitch is nothing till you call it, then calling it defines the pitch, right? It brings a particular kind of reality into being. So, I mean, even if a pitch is high and outside, if it's called a strike, it's still a strike, right? So to some extent, what Weick is saying here is what we decide to call things, the way we decide to make sense of them, defines them in a way, right? We decide our reality to some extent, right? So, and this is really interesting to me. This is related to an idea of what we call linguistic determinism that says that language defines our reality to a certain extent. Language is great because it enables us to do all kinds of things. It allows us to talk about abstract ideas. It allows us to talk about things that aren't present. It allows us to talk about time. Language empowers us in a lot of ways, but also it limits us in ways that we can't think about, right? And again, I know I'm getting philosophical on you, and I'm getting kind of far out, but we can't even think of things that we don't have words for. And so words really do limit us in a lot of ways, Language limits us. We can't even conceive of things that we don't have words for. I mean, we can think of things that aren't real. We could think about a unicorn, for example. But the only reason we can think about a unicorn is because it's just a goddamn horse with a horn on its head, right? I mean, we have all the words that we need to imagine it, to bring it into a kind of being. But we don't know what we don't know, right? I mean, that's a tautology, but we can't conceive of things that we're not able to speak about, right? For Weick, he says organizations don't just respond to the environment; they create their own environments, and this is done through communication, right? And this is a long line of thinking. The idea that talking about something makes it real, right? That talking about something gives it the weight of reality. It's the thing that the fear of Bloody Mary is based on, right? Like if you stand in the mirror, Candyman, right? You stand in the mirror in your bathroom and say Bloody Mary 3 times, and then Bloody Mary comes and kills you or whatever, right? I mean, that's based on this whole idea that somehow saying things makes them real. It's the same thing with Voldemort in Harry Potter. This is an idea that's very common in Western thought, and has some truth to it, I suggest, right? So Weick says, listen, organizations are made in large part by the way that we talk about them, the way that we communicate about them. And so he was also concerned with figuring out how people organize, how they punctuate, and how they deal with uncertainty, equivocality, right? And for Weick, he says, listen, for an organization, the key is that everyone tries to understand it in sort of the same way, right? Because this gives us a more coherent kind of reality. And so reducing uncertainty in messaging is really key for Weick. So he's got a 3-stage model of what he calls equivocality reduction. So the way that we reduce multiple ways of thinking about a scenario. And so these 3 stages are enactment, which we already talked a little bit about, selection, and retention. And this is an ongoing process. It's continually happening all the time, right? It's a collective sense-making activity. So everyone's engaged in these 3 steps in which people who function interdependently engage. So if you're together in an organization where everybody relies on everybody else, according to Weick, we're constantly going through enactment, selection, and retention. So these are the 3 stages. And just like all the people in the organization, these are also interrelated, right? So in enactment, we kind of confront a situation, right? We discuss it, we figure out, hey, this is the situation we're in, right? And in selection, we make sense of it, right? We kind of figure out, okay, this is a situation, let's talk about it, let's figure out what this is, right? And then the best ideas from the time we spend figuring out what these things are, those become sort of part of the organizational history or part of the organizational lore, right? They're the ideas that are retained by the organization. And the idea that these are kept and that these are deemed the best ideas, it influence then selection and enactment in the future. So again, with enactment, we're confronting our environment. In selection, we're trying to figure out how to make sense of that environment. So we're trying to reduce all the different ways we can look at it to one way that we could all sort of agree on. And then in retention, we select the processes that reduce this equivocality, these multiple interpretations. And then we retain them as what we call organizational memory, right? So, you come to school, or we come to school as the faculty to teach you, and so we have to deal with creating that situation. Then we got to figure out how we make sense of it, and then we take those best models for making sense of it, and we incorporate it into the Gordon State College organizational memory. These are the sort of the ideas that inform the way that we make sense of the college moving forward into the future. So, why are we here? Well, we're here to educate students and give them good value for their money and all these different things. And then those get incorporated in the organizational memory. And so then as we move forward, we're like, okay, well, what do we do in this situation? Well, we know that we're here and that our goal is to educate students and give them good value and so on, right? And that influences how we make sense of our activity in the future as a group, right? As a group of educators. So things to remember about Weich's model. There is no single answer to complex organizational problems, right? What we're looking for is plausibility, not accuracy. So what we want a plausible explanation for what the hell we're doing, not necessarily even an accurate one, right? We don't have to all have an accurate idea of what the hell we're doing. We just have to have a plausible idea that we share about what we're doing. We have to realize that plans aren't really solutions, right? They're just mutually agreed upon ways of thinking and dealing with things. And uh, we can reach a goal in an infinite number of ways, right? And indeed, that goal can change over time. Finally, in general, workers, the members of an organization, oftentimes make the mistake of thinking that the vision of the organization is the order that exists in their heads, and that's how the organizations actually operate. But in fact, organizations usually act and then think, right? They make sense of the actions they take after the fact. And so we create plans in order to have something for people to follow. And generally, we behave in less than rational ways, even though we would never want to admit it, right? So for Weich, organizing is never a tidy process. It's always complicated. So he compares organizing to jazz, right? Where there's sort of a basic structure that undergirds it, but then there's a lot of improvisation and changes throughout, right? And if we try and maintain the idea that an organization's rational and orderly in order to make it seem legitimate, that's just futile and costly, right? Organizations are not rational. And then, of course, normally I'd ask you, does your personal experience bear this out? And I can tell you, as someone who worked in the business world for a long time before going back to school to become a teacher, even in for-profit organizations where the idea is very clear about what you want to do, which is just make money, right? Even in organizations like that, people make wildly irrational decisions all the time that are based on greed, on insecurities, personal insecurities. I mean, people are wildly irrational, and we like to think that we're not. But at base, much more of our behavior is motivated by irrational elements than rational ones. So, of course, the major critique of Weich's theory is that it overemphasizes the non-rational features of organizational life. And it downplays the ways that organizations can and do execute rational plans, right? And then finally, I want to talk about the last part of this lecture in this chapter, Nicholas Luhmann, and what we call the autopoietic organization. And so Luhmann was a German sociologist who said that organizations are self-reproducing, like cells, and this self-reproducing ability is known as autopoiesis, right? And so he says that autopoiesis could be applied to the understanding of social systems, including organizations, right? He says that organizations are constantly changing in that they're constantly regenerating, recreating themselves at all times, right? And your body works this way, right? Your body is autopoietic. I forget what it is, but I read somewhere that after, your body's constantly generating new cells, right? And so now, at 47 years old, I am literally a completely different person than I was at 7 years old. Like, every cell in my body has been replaced. None of them are the same. I'm not at all the same person that I was when I was 7 years old, because I'm constantly reproducing cells, right? I'm self-reproducing. And so Luhmann looks at this and he says, listen, communication is the operational process that makes social systems possible. And social systems are nothing but communication. And each organization or system has its own autopoietic system of production and reproduction. And when you think about it, I mean, this, of course, is true. So Gordon State, for example, Uh, the students are constantly changing, right? In 10 years, we'll have a completely different student body than what we have now. In 10 years, you'll have a different faculty than what you have now. But the organization, right, the name of the organization stays static, right? Gordon State College. But the actual elements of Gordon have changed, right? I mean, hell, some of the buildings might be completely different. The landscaping might be different. The location of the college might be different. So you see, right, that these things are constantly evolving, constantly changing. And so that's what Luhmann was getting at. And so for Luhmann, the fundamental purpose of the social system is not the preservation of its existence, but rather the production and preservation of its difference. So what he's saying here is that difference is what demarcates a social system from its environment. So what he's saying here is that organizations are, in a way, defined in the negative. Organizations are defined by what they are not. They're not everything outside of the organization, right? We think about language in the same way. So a desk is a desk because it's not a table, right? A desk is a desk because it's not a spoon, right? It's defined by what it is not. So, again, difference is what demarcates a social system from its environment. And autopoietic organizations are in a constant state of renewal. They're not permanent. They're constantly new, right? And in fact, we should think of them as operating as operatively closed systems, which allow external influence within a construct of difference. So we allow external influences to operate on us, but only to the extent that the us as the organization, right? Us as organization is defined by difference, is not being part of everything else, right? As being separate from the world, right? I hope that made some sense, and that's it for this chapter. Thanks.